All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I'm Brady Walker, Senior Content Marketing Manager at Custora. I'm excited to be here today with Jordan Elkind, the Head of Product Management here at Custora, who'll be presenting on data-driven, consumer-centric analyses, customer-centric analyses that you can do to mitigate the risk of big business decisions. Just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. We try to do these webinars once a month based on what is of interest to you guys. So please, after the webinar, we'd really appreciate it if you fill out a very quick survey on what you liked, what we can improve, and some topics that you're interested in us covering next. If you have a question, please chat it into the Q&A box and Jordan will get to them at the end of the webinar. If for any reason we don't get to your question during the session, we'll be sure to follow up via email. As always, we will share the deck and the recording afterwards. All of our webinars are available as audio-only podcasts on our podcast stream Custora Time, which is available on all major podcasting services. And with that, I'm going to hand things over to Jordan. Jordan, take it away.
Hello, thank you, Brady. Welcome to everyone who's joining us. Thank you for taking time out of your afternoon on this lovely autumnal Tuesday to hear about the incredibly uplifting topic of risk. Turns out it's a lot more fun and interesting than it sounds on paper. We'll get into that in just a moment. This is going to be a super lean and efficient short session here. We're going to go rapid fire with a few simple frameworks and a few case studies as well. We'll start by talking about risk and why it's basically everywhere. Then we'll do kind of a philosophical deep dive into the nature of risk. What is it that makes risky decisions risky? And finally, I'll introduce 3 frameworks for better decisions powered by customer insights. And then, as Brady mentioned at the end, we'll leave time for any questions that folks might have. So without further ado, let's get going. As you can see, we work with lots of great brands, but that's not why we're here today. So I wanted to start by talking a little bit about risk, which is that kind of bummer part of the 10K that you roll your eyes at when you come across it, certainly in business school. And before defining exactly what risk is or the nature of risk, I thought we would just take a quick scan of some of the headlines. Without expending too much effort, it becomes immediately clear that risk abounds in the day-to-day operations of virtually every retail organization. Bankruptcy, rolling out high-stakes new policies, like accepting your competitors' returns, even geopolitical risk. And so I thought I would actually start by kicking it off to you guys. Let's do a quick straw poll. The poll is now open. The question is, do you find yourself spending more time thinking about the upside or the downside in managing your business? Well, upside is all of the great opportunities that you have in front of you, campaigns, incremental revenue. Downside is risk. Let's just take one more moment here. Okay. So it turns out that we have a very, very optimistic group of folks here. Most people are focused on the upside associated with running their business. Let me spend the rest of the time trying to change your mind and convince you all the reasons that you should be focused on the risk in front of you. But for those who are actually focused on risks day in and day out, what are the ones that are most top of mind for you? I'm just going to launch the poll here so we can go through this together. Quickly, the different types of risks that we're highlighting here. Performance risk is like, I'm worried about not being able to hit our financial targets. Liquidity risk is the risk that we're going to run out of cash. Regulatory risk would encompass things like GDPR, CCPA, new data privacy regulations. Reputational risk, we're embarrassed on social media. We do something that requires us to step it back. Technology risk, like we have a complicated tech stack. What if something goes wrong? Other or maybe you are totally risk-free, in which case I would love to grab drinks with you after the webinar and learn about the secret of your success. Okay. Let's close the poll here. Just to share the results here, this is really interesting. The vast majority of folks here are concerned about performance risk. So the challenge of hitting targets year in and year out, some healthy smattering of regulatory and technology risk as number 2 and 3. This is good. This is really consistent with the types of things that we tend to see when we talk to organizations day to day. The vast majority are concerned about the clear and present challenges associated with meeting their goals or comping year over year. Okay, so now that I've done a fair amount of scaremongering and tried to convince you why there are 16 different flavors of risk, let me take a step back and explain why this is a subject that I am so passionate about evangelizing with organizations. If you sit on enough of these webinars week in and week out, or go to conferences like Karma, the conference that Custora hosted just a few weeks ago, we tend to focus very much on the art of the possible. There's always a lot of conversation about using customer data to drive growth, agile war rooms, building a stronger experimental culture, and all of that, by the way, is laudable and 100% correct. However, in talking to retailers, while the responses today were not totally representative of what we've seen in terms of the mind share dedicated to upside versus downside, we tend to find that more often than not, businesses are trying to minimize the downside associated with big, hairy, ambiguous decisions. For example, should we launch a costly new loyalty program? Should we build out the supply chain and marketing engine and real estate footprint and navigate all the regulatory complexities of expanding into a new market? Or heck, we've got a lot of really expensive real estate at the same time that foot traffic is declining. Can we afford to close stores without shooting ourselves in the foot from a demand perspective? These decisions might seem radically different, but I guarantee that all of these actually fundamentally have a few things in common. So now we transition to part 2, our philosophical deep dive into what makes risky decisions risky. And thinking about some of the examples that we just gave, launching a new loyalty program, expanding into a new market, closing store decisions, the first thing that makes them risky is that definitionally they're new. We're considering trying something that's never been done before. For example, if we're launching in Korea, there's a very good chance that we don't currently operate in Korea. Secondly, and we'll talk about this in a minute, these are often decisions or scenarios that are really hard to test. We can't rely on our good old randomized control framework to get a read on whether something will work or not. For example, if we're a retailer thinking about closing stores, we can't test the impact of closing our Woodbury Common outlet by keeping it open only every other day. And thirdly, these decisions are difficult to reverse. We can't really dip a toe in the waters. Once we make a decision, we have to dive in head first. For example, once we commit to accepting our competitors' returns, it's going to be costly and embarrassing to unwind that policy. So I can hear myself saying this out loud, and I can tell that I sound like a big buzzkill. And I guarantee my goal here was not to bum you out on a Tuesday afternoon. It was actually to take this problem statement, like how do we navigate this incredible ambiguity, complexity, and risk associated with the unknown, and actually provide some solutions. How do we cut through the noise and make better decisions with imperfect information? As with most of the thought leadership that we try to bring to you, we have stolen shamelessly from the great brands that we work with. We've been partnering with some amazing industry leaders on exactly these types of decisions over the past few months. And I want to share with you 3 of the tools that we've learned for bringing customer insights into decision-making under conditions of business risk. So think of these as antidotes to those gnarly challenges that make risky decisions risky. First, when you can't run a test, fake it. this might sound like we're cutting corners, but I will promise you that there is a very well-respected group that has been doing just this for ages with glee, and that is economists. It's very often in economics, it's the case that it's not feasible to run a controlled experiment. And so what economists will typically do is look to identify natural experiments or manufacture synthetic control groups in the data to measure the impact of an action or strategy. Quick reminder before everybody's eyes glaze over, they tell me they don't remember what synthetic control groups are. Control groups are really helpful, just a randomized subset of the population that we're trying to test, because it help us baseline what would have happened if we didn't take a certain action. Kind of a nice counterfactual. So what does this look like in practice? Well, take the case of one retailer that we were working with. They were deciding whether to continue supporting their private label credit card. Now, I don't know whether folks on the phone here face a similar challenge in their own businesses. For those who do, you are certainly well aware that a private label credit card is very costly to maintain and brings a tremendous amount of complexity. And in fact, the retailer realized that the economics only worked out on renewing their contract with the issuer if the credit card led to significant changes in customer spend and customer loyalty. So the question here was, do we reinvest in this costly, expensive strategy? The answer being, it only works if we can prove that it's driving a lot of value for us. Now, when we looked at the data actually seemed to tell a super clear story here. Looking at virtually any metric, predicted spend, historical spend, orders per customer, AOV, credit card holders outperformed non-holders substantially, right? So case closed. Well, unfortunately not, because there's this very gnarly problem of self-selection. The customers who like your brand the most, it turns out, are the most to open the credit card. So even looking at changes over time, it's really hard to infer causality. This is a real bind, but luckily this retailer had an ace up its sleeve, which was our wonderful neighbors to the north. It turns out that due to financial regulatory issues, they were actually not permitted to market or issue the credit card to Canadian citizens. This was the perfect type of natural experiment, the kind that economists dream about at night. So we looked at the customers who opened the card in the US and identified what made them unique, their behavioral patterns, their demographic skew, the way that they engaged with the brand in email and on site. Then we mined through their Canadian customer base and identified similar customers who just didn't have the opportunity to open the card. And these customers served as our baseline. And it turns out that when we compared US cardholders to their Canadian lookalike counterparts, a very, very different picture emerged. The gains in customer loyalty and spend were much, much, much smaller than initially thought. So a lot of that credit card goodness seemed to be based on self-selection amongst loyal customers. Like your best customers just gravitate towards credit card. And so based on this retailer actually ended up winding down their credit card program. Let's look at another example quickly. This one related to store closure. What's the impact of closing a store? Do customers who shopped at that store shop elsewhere when the store is closed, or is that demand lost forever? So working with an omnichannel retailer, we did a simple pre and post analysis. And it turns out that when you look at it in this way, it looks like a very, very bleak picture associated with store closure. Just tremendously hopeless, right? Huge drop off in demand. This is the spend of customers who shopped in a store that was closed before it was closed, and here was the group or the spend afterwards. But unfortunately, as before, it was really unclear how much of this was actually due to the impact of store closure versus just natural trends in the customer base, like customers trading, leaving your brand, dropping out of the category, defecting for a competitor. Luckily, this was a case where a natural control scenario presented itself as well. It turns out if you dig deep enough, you almost always get lucky with these types of natural experiments and synthetic control groups. In this case, the retailer had a crystal clear decision rubric for whether to close a store. First was the store failing on financial metrics. Think of this as basically four-wall cash flow. So yes, no. And if the store was closing, did it have an imminent lease event coming up in the near future, basically an opportunity to close the store? If the answer was yes, meaning the store was failing financials and it had a lease coming up, then the decision would be to close the store. If no, this is a store that we would like to be able to close, but actually can't because there's no opportunity to get out of the lease. In other words, they're lookalikes that can serve as a control group. Bingo. When we benchmarked against this synthetic or lookalike control group, a very, very different picture emerged of the impact of store closure. In fact, the vast majority of demand loss that we saw between pre and post was just due to customer churn across the whole business, right? Customers getting tired of your brand, leaving and going elsewhere. And only a very small percentage itself was attributable to the actual store closure. This gave the retailer a totally data-driven lens for assessing the impact of closure, while also redoubling their efforts to prevent this big chunk, all the value that was being lost just to customer churn. So to recap, if you can't test it, fake it. Second tool of the trade. It turns out that even for super seasoned retail leaders, it is immensely difficult to harness your intuition to answer questions like, what's the bottom line impact of X? What's the lifetime value impact of Y? It's just tough to reason about the impact of something as fuzzy as customer loyalty or customer spend. That's why we find that the best retailers actually decompose customer behavior into digestible chunks that are easier to reason about. Many of you, I'm guessing, are probably familiar with a customer behavior tree like this. Quick overview, it breaks down revenue into number of transacting customers and revenue per customer. Then it breaks down revenue per customer into orders per customer and average order value, breaks down average order value into items per order and average unit price, or AUR. There's no magic here. There doesn't need to be any predictive fairy dust sprinkled on this. What's so powerful about a framework like this is that it sharpens our reasoning and intuition about the predicted impact of our actions. For example, we recently worked with a retailer that was considering launching a loyalty program. Now, they determined that the annual cost of this program was roughly $5 million. I imagine some of you are like bleeding from the ears right now when you hear that. For those who actually have loyalty programs, that's probably understandable. It might even seem like a bargain once you factor in the actual program management costs, the resources required to keep it going, opportunity costs. It's not crazy. So what did this retailer need to believe in order for this to be an accretive investment? Well, they had the hypothesis that the loyalty would primarily drive additional purchases for their customers. So this loyalty program would create additional purchase occasions as opposed to other programs which might be designed to grow basket size or reduce promotionality. And we worked with them to do some scenario planning. For example, for their low CLV customers, so let's say the customers in the bottom 50% by spend, this would need to boost their orders per customer by about 10%. Let's say from 1 order a year to 1.1. And for their high CLV customers, this new loyalty program would need to boost orders per customer by much more, by about 25%. Let's say from 4 to 5 orders per year. Framed in this way, the retailer was able to reason more effectively about what was required for success. And they actually decided that this was feasible and that they should move ahead with the loyalty program launch. But it wasn't just based on gut intuition or a finger in the wind, can we grow CLV by 20%? It was clearly tied to the customer behavior mechanism by which they were going to achieve that outcome, as well as the program design itself. So tip number 2 is, what do you need to believe tied to legit customer economics? Tool number 3, and one that I am particularly excited about, leverage qualitative data in combination with quantitative data to help drill into what's likely to happen. Now, especially amongst us data-driven marketers, there's a certain amount of skepticism towards qualitative data. I can kind of hear people on the phone like groaning or sighing. And I get it. It's fuzzy. It can be difficult to know where to go with it. For example, how the heck do we take action on something like brand sentiment? And most importantly, it's often rolled up to the aggregate, so the whole customer base, losing the richness that we get with individual or segment level insights. But what we've found is that marketers often throw the baby out with the bathwater. Quantitative data, so historical metrics, predictive metrics, can help us understand what's happening, but qualitative data, used in the right way, motivated by a specific question, and tied back to actual customers, that can help us understand why what's happening is happening and what to do about it. Take the case of a retailer that we're working with who discovered that they have a huge challenge with customer retention. We actually partnered with them to identify the life cycle status of different customers in their customer base, dig into who their churning customers are, as a way of understanding who are the customers that they're losing. And it turns out that these customers had a pretty strong demographic and behavioral profile. They were primarily customers in their late 30s and 40s who gravitated towards core heritage styles for the brand. Now, this lit up all kinds of light bulbs for the retailer because you see, over the past year, they had veered hard towards courting millennial customers, both in their brand marketing. So think about sponsorship of activations, Coachella strategy, and so forth, along with their merchandising assortment. They had veered hard into pursuing kind of a more consolidated range of basics, similar to Everlane or Uniqlo, and limited range of colors. But from the data, it seemed really clear that they were alienating their core customers. So now this retailer is considering all kinds of sweeping strategy changes, thinking about what type and format of stores they should keep open and where, revamping their merchandise assortment, so expanding back into the long tail of more boho, quirky, kind of heritage styles for them. But now that they know what's going on, they're actually using qualitative data to inform their strategy. So they're able to laser target customers who are at risk of churning or have shown a propensity of churning and ask them exactly why they're defecting from the brand, what types of store format they prefer and merchandise and so forth. It's essentially enabling them to de-risk their decision in a way that they should have before they embarked on this millennial first strategy in the first place. So to recap the big ideas here, managing risk is a cruddy and unglamorous but essential part of reality as a 21st century retailer. Secondly, risk comes from the unknown, from trying things with limited historical precedent, without the ability to test. But the toolkit that we just laid out, identifying natural experiments or synthetic control groups, scenario planning and what-if analysis, and bringing qualitative data into the mix, these can all significantly help de-risk those decisions that keep you and many of our fellow marketers up at night. So with that, I would actually like to conclude the scripted portion of the event. Brady, let me turn it back to you. Any questions from those of our listeners on the phone?
We do have a couple questions. We might run a little over, but I think that's okay for anybody who wants to stick around. The first question is, can this framework be used for store openings as well as store closings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So thinking about our toolkit for decision-making under conditions of risk, natural experiments or control groups, scenario planning, and qualitative data, I would actually argue that all three of those could be deployed to help us figure out where should we open our next store. How would we do this with natural control groups? Well, let's look at patterns of historical store openings and see if we can identify sister cities or metropolitan areas in the data where the only difference was the opening of a store in one and not the other. So for example, maybe a retailer previously opened a store in Columbus, Ohio, but didn't open one in Cincinnati or Cleveland. So looking at the increase in new customer demand and retention of local customers can help us figure out exactly how much incrementality we're likely to get by expanding our store footprint. what do you need to believe? We could go through an exercise of thinking through, okay, when we open a store, what impact does that have on customer behavior? Chances are primarily that increases the number of transacting customers, but maybe that secondarily increases the frequency of transactions for local customers. Going through what do you need to believe exercise could help us if we're trying to justify against the cost of opening or operating an individual store location. And lastly, qualitative data. We've actually seen this with some of our fast-growing retail brands that are expanding their retail footprint. They'll survey customers in high-value clusters, let's say in Austin, Texas, to figure out where else they shop and what are the types of products that they'd like to see in a local store. What occasions would they look to shop for? So all of those tools in our tool belt can actually help us de-risk not just store closure, but store opening as well.
Cool. We do have one more question. For loyalty program assessment, is 10% movement in the bottom 50% and 25% on high LTV customer base a realistic target? How would you go about finding what is a realistic range if we haven't seen patterns of movement in the bottom 50% historically?
So full disclosure, to protect the innocent, the numbers that we showed in this presentation were illustrative or directional. Those were not actually the numbers that were provided. It's a fair question. And not to be weaselly, I would say it depends on the nature of your business. So what is your business model? Are you a retailer with a very long inter-purchase cycle and a long planned purchase cadence, or a retailer that is more about spontaneous purchases with a shorter inter-purchase time? That will help guide the realm of the possible. It would be very difficult for, let's say, a durable goods or heavy furniture brand to get a low value customer to go from 1 to 3 purchases every year, perhaps somewhat more realistic for a fast fashion or impulse kind of brand. Similarly, knowing a bit more about the brand's historical retention efforts to date, their price point and promotional strategy would help us offer a point of view. I think the lens that we would bring to that is, having worked with a lot of brands that have initiated loyalty programs, or what I'll call pseudo loyalty programs. So targeted VIP events, clienteling focused on nurturing loyalty amongst our most valuable customers. We've got a pretty good idea by vertical business model, company size, and so forth for what are the potential ranges of what's possible. It also might be possible through some clever testing and experimentation to get a sense of what's likely to be achievable. So before rolling out a white glove loyalty program, try some surprise and delight tactics with customers across different bands of your loyalty spectrum. So expedited shipping or outreach from a personal shopper to see, hey, when we really invest in one-to-one personalization and up-leveling service, what's the type of gains that we can expect to see? That will give a sense of at least the ceiling of what's possible.
Cool. Well, I think that's all we have time for today. Thank you, everybody, for coming and joining us for this. Thank you, Jordan, for presenting. And as always, within the next day or two, you'll get an email with the deck and the recording, links to the podcast, and all that good stuff. And also a short survey on how we can improve, what you like, and if there's anything you'd like us to cover in the future. So thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks a lot.